So good evening. I would like to welcome the audience and our viewers from live stream and also our esteemed speakers to our panel today as part of the Delphi Economic Forum. Yes, and I see we have Jennifer Merli who's joining us from New York as well. Our panel today is on our sustainable future. And we're very happy to have with us today three esteemed speakers. We have Keith Tuffley, who's the Vice Chairman, Global Co-Head of Sustainability and Corporate Transitions from Citi. We also have Jennifer Merli, who you can see on screen, who, as I mentioned, she's joining us today from New York. She's the Vice President of Corporate Sustainability from Mastercard. And we have Peter Gassmann, who's a Global ESG Leader and Global Strategy Leader of PwC Germany. So welcome to our panel. To give the members of the audience a little bit of a backdrop of what we're going to be discussing today. This panel is happening within the framework of a shift that we're seeing overall from CSR as a do good to feel good to a do good because it's good business. Just last year at the Delphi Forum, we welcomed John Kerry, and he told us that the green transition is the greatest investment opportunity of our time. And just a few months later, we had the CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink, saying that we focus on sustainability, not because we're environmentalists, but because we're capitalists and fiduciaries to our clients. The past month has also welcomed a flurry of regulations on both sides of the Atlantic as the legal framework is aligning around sustainability. We had the EU's update to consumer rules. This is aiming to promote circular economy and also combat greenwashing. And we also had an update to the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. From the side of the United States, we had the Securities and Exchange Commission's proposal to make climate risk disclosures mandatory and prevent greenwashing. So to frame today's conversation a little bit with our speakers, our goal is to inform and inspire as we discuss what your companies are doing in the realm of CSR, ESG, and investing in sustainability. The second thing we're going to talk about is the impact of the current geopolitical situation in reaching net zero, and of course, what lies ahead for ESG. A lot is happening. There are a lot of new challenges to discuss, but your companies are all working to be part of the solution. So since it seems like we have a good connection, I would like to start with Jennifer Merli from Mastercard. Jennifer, your company is the heart of the global payment system, and it's made many commitments in the realm of sustainability. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, thank you, Cheryl. So pleased to be here with you, and apologies that I'm not there in person. I would love to be in there in person. So as Cheryl mentioned, I'm the Vice President of Sustainability at Mastercard, and I wanted to talk about our ESG values today and how we put them into practice inside and out. So as Cheryl mentioned, we focus on ESG not just because doing well by doing good feels like the right thing to do, but because it drives financial value. And that value is aligned with our business goals like financial inclusion. It differentiates us with customers and with consumers. It creates commercial opportunities. It helps us attract and retain talent. There are so many reasons why ESG and its values and its principles need to be a focus. But it is really key to our goal of building a more inclusive and sustainable digital economy. And it's that intersection of business and purpose, specifically prosperity with both people and planet in mind, as mutual beneficiaries is really focused. So when we talk about the E, we focus first and foremost on reducing our own emissions. That's across Scope 1, 2, and 3. We have a 2040 net zero goal that builds on our existing reduction commitments with the United Nations 1.5 degree pledge. We were the first in the payments industry to actually get approval for our science-based target back in 2018. But as a global payments technology company, we can do the right thing and focus on making sure that we are focused on our own emissions and investments in renewable energy. But our real opportunity to create exponential impact at scale is by activating our network. Because we sit at the intersection of commerce, We work with 20,000 banks and 80 million merchants and 3 billion consumers. So with that in mind, we're emerging from the pandemic, but not the climate crisis. And there is a wide recognition that proactive investment in nature and innovation to engage consumers in more meaningful ways is really needed to make transformative change. So in that intersection of business and purpose, we have several ways that we are trying to engage that global network of the partners. One is called Priceless Planet Coalition. That's 100 merchants, banks, and other partners who've engaged with us to restore 100 million trees by 2025. We have a partnership with Economy from Sweden to offer carbon calculation that lets cardholders know the approximate carbon emissions impacted every purchase that they make and helps them better understand the impact that their behavior has. And then we also newly launched a Sustainability Innovation Lab, which is a dedicated co-creation space for Mastercard and our partners to design climate-conscious digital products and solutions. And one of those main priorities is iterating on that carbon calculator that I just mentioned and helping it scale even further. So many things that we do are on the inside and out, but as I mentioned, where we're really hoping to make exponential impact is in activating at a global level with as many like-minded constituencies and partners as possible.
Great, thank you, Jenna, for your introductory remarks. Now, before there are a lot of questions that come out of the things that you've said, but before we get to our questions, I'd like to give the other speakers also the opportunity to present themselves, starting with Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Cheryl. I think Jennifer already mentioned quite a lot of the themes that come through when we work with financial institutions. And I think what is most important is that the financial industry has a huge opportunity, but maybe also the obligation to finance and help to transform this ESG transformation. It's a multi-decade transformation that needs a lot of funding, both debt and equity. There were estimates that needs to be funding in the region of $125 trillion, and we saw the developments in Glasgow. Now, what we are worried about a little bit and what we work with is, in order to do this effectively, of course, you need standards, you need clear data, you need to understand whether you're on the right track, and maybe I help a little bit to bring some clarity in this, I think, I would almost say in this mess of regulation and in this mess of standards that we see. So maybe starting with, we have of course, the umbrella reporting framework, the GRI, the SASB. We have single issue standards, TCFD and SBTI standards. We have the rating system, and you can imagine that both investors but also many clients are very confused by this. So we really appreciate the development that we saw also in COP26, the attempt of the trustees of the IFRS to come up with a joint standard to kind of solidify, harmonize the standards. I think that's the right way forward. I don't want to go through all the different regulatory requirements, but I'm sure that Jennifer and also Keith, I mean, if you have a global business, you are faced with very different regulatory requirements and rules. And I think one of the ambition that we all should have is to come up with a joint understanding what is important and how the finance industry can and should transform the industry and society over time.
True. And again, there's a lot to go on at that point as well. I've kept my notes. Before we get to our questions, Keith, would you like to also say a few words?
Sure. Thank you, Cheryl. Well, I might just start by saying that I certainly agree with the comments that John Kerry had made about this being a huge economic opportunity, which absolutely it is. I will disagree with Larry Fink, though, to say that we're not environmentalists. I mean, I can proudly say I am an environmentalist. That is one of my motivations. It's not just because of making money for your shareholders and looking after the short-term interests of all our stakeholders, but we should all be proudly doing this also because we're environmentalists. But I'll just start by saying that. I'll also start by saying that Citi is the second largest lender to the energy sector globally. We're also the most global of all the global investment banks. We're in 95 countries. We have people on the ground in 95 countries, which means that we're very exposed and very interested in the emerging markets, which is critical, as we know, to climate action. So for these reasons, we have a very significant responsibility, but also a very major role to play in climate action, and also what I call the twin crisis of nature and biodiversity, but also the growing issue of global inequalities. Now, these are not just crises, these are emergencies. We need to put this into context. Since we really all knew about the science of climate change since probably around 1990, if not earlier, emissions have risen in the order of 40% in 30 years. To achieve a 1.5 degrees, the science is telling us we need to reduce emissions by 45% in 8 years. So 40% up in 30 years, 45% down in 8 years. This is an emergency. We still completely underestimate this, maybe not in this room or any of those online, but in day-to-day actions, we're completely missing it. It is not an emergency when it comes to day-to-day actions and decision-making. But what is Citi doing about it? Well, there's lots that we are doing about it, and I'll just mention two major initiatives that we're proudly helping to drive. Now, one is all about collaborations. We all know that collaborations are critical to tackle these issues. And the first of that is, an example is with RMI, formerly called the Rocky Mountains Institute, which is setting up the Poseidon principles for the shipping sector, which is to align our financing to a 1.5 trajectory in that sector with a whole bunch of other banks. We're now replicating that initiative across the steel and aviation sectors. And secondly, and probably more importantly, and Peter, you just touched on this a moment ago, is the commitment to decarbonise our financed emissions across all sectors in line with 1.5 degrees, but most importantly, working with a whole bunch of other investors and banks to do so. Now, we've done it with our net zero plan, which we announced several weeks ago for the energy and power sectors. We've done 12 months of work to try to understand every single emission embedded in those lending activities in the entire portfolios for energy and power across the globe. And we've committed to decarbonise those portfolios in line with the IEA net zero 2050 scenario, which is effectively 1.5 degree scenario. So that means 29% reduction by 2030 in energy and 63% reduction in energy intensity in our power portfolio. So we now need to deliver on this. And that's my point about actually delivering on the ground as opposed to commitments being made. Now, this clearly is not enough. The GFANZ, which Peter, you were touching on, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, is a global collaboration now comprising literally hundreds of investors and banks, insurance companies, other service providers across the financial sector, all of whom have committed to decarbonise our financed emissions and, more importantly, to make commitments to 2030. We all know this is the decade. Unless we get seriously attack in the order of 45% of emissions this decade, there's no chance we can get there by net zero by 2050. So if all of those members were to actually do this work, not just to make the commitments, but also to put it into action, we will be shifting capital to low carbon solutions and to those companies that are actually driving action and driving proper outcomes. But as we saw in the Climate Action 100 Plus report last week, there's a huge gap between commitments and targets and investments and capital expenditures. So, for example, whilst in the Climate Action 100 report, it indicated that now most of their 166, what they call focus companies, these are the largest emitting companies in the world, whilst most of them have now got reasonably good governance and appropriate targets, so there's still more to be done, only 5% have actually got capital aligned with those targets. So commitments and targets on the one side, 5% are actually doing what they're saying they're going to do, right? So that's what I'm seeing day to day in all the transactions that we get involved in. There is a massive gap between top of the house commitments and targets and actually now doing it. Now, that's understandable because it takes time to filter down and put in the systems, but that's the stage we're at now. We really have to now drive these commitments and these targets into tangible day-to-day actions. Thanks, Cheryl.
So, Keith, you mentioned a few different things about commitments to decarbonize, the willingness to invest heavily in the environment and make the transition. But what comes to mind is that all of this is obviously not happening in a bubble. There are great challenges. And what I'd like to ask you is, what is the expected impact of the global events? We've been through a pandemic, there are disruptions to supply channels, and the energy crisis and the current war on Ukraine. What sort of an impact do you envision this having on this transition to net zero?
Yeah, well, it's, I'm sure many of us were there we all were there 2 years ago when the pandemic started. I think initially in those first few months, a number of us in the ESG community were very concerned about the impact of the pandemic on the commitment to the long term, but the emergency of climate action. It's both. It's a long-term journey, but it's emergency action. We can't forget that. It's not long-term. I think we can do it in the long term. We just have to continue doing it today, but for a long time. What actually occurred was that there was a surprising and very impressive reaction, I think, particularly from certain governments, but not from many governments, but also significantly from the private sector, and I include the financial sector within that private sector definition. I would say actually it increased the motivation for many in the real economy and the financial sector to double down on commitments to and actions towards climate action, and to use this as an opportunity to accelerate our transition to a net zero world. Now, of course, what really happened was that we did get a reduction in emissions, but only caused because of a slowdown in economic activity. We all flew less, we drove less, we went to work less, the lights were off at work, economic activity was down, and unfortunately it was an unintended, or at least a non-deliberate outcome, which was a reduction in emissions, not because we were forcing it down through innovation and technology and scaling up of solutions, but because of slowdown of economic activity. We're now seeing a blip up. We saw the IPCC report last week. We're now at 59 gigatons of CO2e per annum, and we've got to get that down to net zero. Yet we've now had the blip up because we're now recovering from the pandemic. The war, equally, initially very impressive response from the EU, I would have to say. A recognition firstly, a recognition of energy independence and security as a first priority. Now, of the approximately 100 billion cubic metres of gas, 40% of the EU's gas is coming from Russia. A commitment to reduce that by 2/3 in 2020 and to zero by 2030. But of course, 60% of that odd is coming from just relocating the gas sources. Having said that, 20% odd is committed through energy efficiency measures, and another 20% odd from wind and solar and other renewables. So the start of recommitting to accelerating the transition to net zero because of the need to become more energy independent. Now, I would say energy independence and security doesn't necessarily mean that every country will be entirely independent in terms of their energy sourcing. There are some countries that will find it extremely hard to source all of their renewable energies from domestically. For example, Japan, with their population, very difficult. They will still have to rely on imports. The question is where those imports will come from and in what form. Our view is that there has to be a significant increase in green hydrogen, and of course green hydrogen will come from renewables. So therefore, massive increase in renewables, partly domestically, partly through undersea cables, for example, from Australia to Singapore, from Morocco to London, and also partly through green hydrogen export. So there'll be certain routes in the world, for example, Western Australia to Japan and Korea, that will become very significant green hydrogen routes, also from the Middle East to Europe. And that we're also seeing from clients a very significant increase in green hydrogen demand because of the Russia-Ukraine situation. So Cheryl, in short-term increase in emissions, but we think a long-term acceleration towards net zero as a result of the conflict.
Well, let's hope. And trying to move towards more of a solutions focus, I'd like to transition a little bit because you mentioned earlier that on this journey, we have some data gaps, and we also have a need for new tools connected to ESG. Would you like to talk a little bit more about that now?
Well, I mean, first of all, let me build a little bit on what Pete was saying, and I would agree to the danger of a short-term increase, because many territories, many countries, rely on Russian sources, and they need to find other sources to have a stable energy supply. But I think what we see with our clients is that, and with governments, that this has spurred a much more open conversation about innovative solutions and actually funding those solutions. And it also has brought home some of the ideas of, in order to have a sustainable sustainable energy supply, you need to have some kind of diversification, which I think a banker knows well as a concept, and that's something that many countries are now doing. Let me build on one other point before I come to your question, Cheryl. I think when we get to the S and the G in relation to this terrible war, I think it was amazing how quickly both the business side and governments reacted. And I think that was already a reflection of the value discussion that was happening in many businesses before. I think it was a much more robust discussion than any time before in terms of the governance, in terms of the value, in terms of the purpose. So I think the speed of decision making, I think, was a reflection of the S and the G of ESG as well. Now, very, very quickly, I don't want to go into the details. Data is a huge issue, and Keith mentioned before the issue of what we call the just transition. So to make sure that we finance also the developing countries, where there is probably most of the opportunities for those countries, but also most of the opportunities to actually find alternative sources for energy. We did a study, PwC and Strategy did a study on the capital markets, and we looked at how cross-border financial market infrastructure players could improve the liquidity of capital markets, sustainable capital markets products, both in terms of depth and liquidity. And if we would be able to agree on data, on common ways to measure it, and actually have central bodies to make sure we have an efficient exchange of those information, like the cross-border financial market infrastructure, then we would be able, we think, to increase the level of capital markets and the liquidity significantly by 2.5%, which is in the next 10 years something in the region of 25 trillion. And a lot of this would be able to funnel to developing countries, which I think would be huge benefit. So as an industry, if we would be able, together with, of course, standard setters, to agree on joint standards, I think there's a lot more room for more liquidity in the market.
That's very encouraging. Jennifer, I'm aware that you're following from abroad right now. I don't know if you'd like to jump in and have the opportunity to respond to some of the discussions that we're having here. And of course, we would also like to hear a little bit more about some of the solutions at Mastercard.
Sure. So one thing I would say gives me optimism in remaining focused on our collective global goals in emissions reductions and staying in line with the 1.5-degree target. It is obvious that, and the science tells us that we are already on an irreversible track. And that, I believe, is what has kept us and has allowed us to remain focused in light of the multitude of other geopolitical, public health crises that we still face today and now are combined. What does give me optimism is that we launched our Priceless Planet Coalition in January of 2020. And if everyone can go back into their time machine and think about what January 2020 looked like, we were right on the cusp of the pandemic. And as of now, we now have over 100 partners who have committed millions of dollars to this Priceless Planet cause. That is despite the pandemic. That is despite the fact that many of our partners have restricted revenue situations that are requiring them to double down in areas where they need to either make up for or otherwise account for deficiencies in their revenue streams, but they still remain committed to Price Planet. And again, I think that is because of this collective acknowledgement that we have no time left to waste. I would say that in our Sustainability Innovation Lab, that, as I said, is intended to be this platform for co-creation. And it is very much focused with our financial services partners. So very focused on consumer, but also B2B. And I think engaging particularly on the B2B side of our business is where we could make a lot of traction. We obviously focus very much on our consumer business because it is 3 billion cardholders, and we do transactions and payments technology work in virtually every corner of the world. But it's our B2B partnerships that are really, and our commercial and corporate partnerships that I think really going to help us co-create and develop at the scale that we need to be transformative. So that innovation lab is one innovation lab that Mastercard currently has. It is based in Stockholm. It is exclusively focused on sustainability and ESG. But we have a framework that we follow for all of our innovation spaces, and that it's intended to be dedicated toward solving a problem statement. And most of those innovation labs have focused on payments, on data, on financial technology. This sustainability lab will do the same, but the problem statement that it's trying to solve for is we have a climate crisis. And what I had read in a great book called by Rebecca Henderson, she said, capitalism helps us solve for crises like this. Someone just hasn't told capitalism yet that we have a climate crisis. So I think in working together, and Cheryl, on the same theme that you've been talking about, when doing well by doing good, that intersection of business and purpose comes together, especially with the support of the financial services sector, where literally trillions of dollars were being pledged toward this innovation. I think we can get there.
Great, thank you. That's some very encouraging remarks as well from you. So we have a few minutes left. We can either have more of a free discussion, or I can give everyone another minute or so to make some concluding remarks. There are many places we can start, and there are many places we can finish. Keith, I'd like to give you the opportunity to develop a little bit more. You've perhaps drawing on the fact that aside from your work at Citi, you've also spent a lot of time lobbying outside of your current role for the promotion of ESG, for trying to rally CEOs to support the Paris Accords. Where do you see ESG going next?
Yeah, well, Cheryl, you use the word lobbying. It's very interesting because often lobbying has an implication to it, doesn't it? And you're absolutely right, though. I mean, it's the right word. It's just that often it's seen to be lobbying behind the scenes as if it's doing the wrong thing. But that's exactly what we were doing when I was running an organisation, an NGO called the B Team, which was a group of CEOs who we brought together, CEOs and civil society leaders who we brought together about a year before the Paris Agreement to really help drive a new generation of leaders, CEOs, to drive real mission and purpose into business, into the private sector. And it just so happened that we set it up at a time when the lobbying, or what I would say the effort to get CEOs in the private sector to support what we wanted to get into the Paris Agreement, which was bold ambitious targets. And that, of course, was effectively the net zero 2050 target, as represented by the 2 degree, or well below 2 degree, to aspiration to 1.5 degree target into the Paris Agreement. So that was a real honour working with those 25 or so CEOs, included people like Ratan Tata, Richard Branson, Paul Polman, Mary Robinson, former President of Ireland, a fantastic group of leaders. And it was a real learning experience for me because as a banker, suddenly thrust into this role of helping to get CEOs to support a movement of good business activity. But I think what it showed me was that there is a significant turning point that's occurred in the last 5 years. With all the grey hair that I've got, I've lived through business in the 90s, in the late 80s, when all that we spoke about was shareholder value, short-term shareholder value. If I had spoken to CEOs in the mid-90s about think about your business model in 30 years' time and think about all your stakeholders, I literally would have been laughed out the room. Whereas now we are talking about business models in 30 years, simply because net zero 2050 is not driven by anything other than science. Mm-hmm. If we want to live on a stable planet, net zero 2050, that's all it is. But it's meant that we as bankers and we as leaders and we as in accounting firms and financial service providers, we can now advise and support companies to say, think about your business model. Is your business model suited to a net zero world? Will you survive? Do you want to be part of the problem or part of the solution? How are you going to transition? How can we help you to transition? It's a completely different conversation. So what's occurred is that corporates have now become far more mission-driven. Now, that sounds a bit optimistic for many of us, but that's the direction we're heading towards, which is it's a wonderful thing. Secondly, investors are becoming far more activist. An example that we've been working on, which we're proud of being working on, has been advising Brookfield, very large Canadian pension fund, and Mike Cannon-Brookes, very successful internet or tech entrepreneur in Australia, to make a hostile takeover bid for AGL, the largest emitting company in Australia. Why? Because they saw they could make money out of accelerating the decommissioning and the transition to net zero for that business as a whole. They are becoming activists, investors becoming activists. And the third thing I'll just mention, Cheryl, is the very optimistic evolution in what I'd call leadership at the CEO, board and C-suite level. I think so many CEOs, boards and C-suite are now becoming far more aware of the big global challenges we face and recognise we're not going to solve them by relying on just simply pushing it back to politicians or policymakers or NGOs. The private sector has to take responsibility. And fortunately, we do have a new breed of leaders coming through who recognise the responsibilities they hold. So I'm optimistic about the direction we're heading. We just need to move faster. Mm.
Peter, I saw you nodding your head quite a bit on some of the things that Keith was saying. Would you like to use the opportunity to take a minute before we conclude?
Very briefly, and then maybe we hand over to Jennifer for the final words. But I would build on what Keith was saying. However, I see at the moment there's still many CEOs who struggle with the short-term requirements, and there are still, stakeholder requirements and shareholder requirements, and the long-term setup. And I'm also optimistic, but we are not there yet, that we find the right means, tools, measures to balance the long-term value creation path with the short-term requirements, so that the CEOs can operate within guardrails of acceptable returns and nevertheless set up the company for the future. I think that's what we are aiming for, and that's what I'm seeing happening more and more.
Okay, that's great. Jennifer, we have about 1 minute left. Would you like to make a concluding remark?
Yeah, I would only build on perhaps what was just said, which is I believe that CEOs and in boardrooms everywhere, there is a growing, not just appreciation, but demand for these types of environmental and social issues to be raised to the level of not just risk mitigation strategy, but a strategy that drives value for employees, for stakeholders, for future generations. And I think that ultimately is driving a shift in how we define value. And I think it's not surprising to hear our esteemed panelists talk about what they thought was the most important thing in short-term returns. Even now, with the way that we are redefining value, there are short-term returns related to ESG, there are mid to long-term returns. And so there's a spectrum that we're managing to. And I think that the companies that are really getting it right are approaching it in the manner that there are short, mid to long-term goals. They are all equated to a different quantification of value, and that quantification has ESG at its heart.
Well, thank you. I would like to thank all of you for your participation and for your comments and your food for thought today. It is very comforting to know that we're ending on a note of optimism and that we have so many great minds rallied around these big challenges, which seem very frequently the geopolitical situation is throwing a cog in the wheel. But with so many people working together to find common solutions and the creation of so many useful tools, I'm happy to end on this note of optimism that the goals are achievable as long as we accelerate our efforts. So thank you very much. Thank you to the audience. And again, thank you, Jennifer, for joining us from abroad.
Thanks.